Well, hello everyone, and now we have another lecture series, this time on the Reformations in European religion um, in the 16th century. And this is one of those really fascinating topics, at least for me anyway, because the scholarship over the last 50 years or so has really changed on the issue of the Reformations. First of all, most of the time you'll see it as a singular reformation, which suggests a monolithic movement, one in which there was very little, one that assumed a certain type of reformation, and that is the Protestant Reformation. Protestantism, of course, has many different varieties, and so there were many Protestant reformations to begin with. But it also devalued the idea of a Catholic Reformation, which we will look at as well, that the Catholic Church will reform itself, um, as well as looking at those groups that broke away from the Catholic Church because they wanted certain types of change. So there are really lots of change in religion that goes on during this time. That kind of unity of Christendom, of Christian Europe, is broken during this time, and you see lots of different Christian groups emerge: Lutherans, Presbyterians, Reformed Christians, Baptists, Catholic, as it's defined in a very particular way in the 16th and 17th century. So, one historian, cultural historian, um, regarded this as Jacques Barjon is his name, regarded this as the first of the great European revolutions. It was a revolution of the conscience. It said that you could believe what you want to believe, or and in some cases, one of the great legacies of the Reformation is to not believe at all. Is really what we're looking at here, as opposed to that great sense of cultural unity and oneness that you had throughout the Middle Ages in the Catholic Church. Okay, well, let's look in this lecture at some precursors to the Reformation, some issues, what's going on in late medieval Christianity uh, prior to the Reformation. So we'll look at religion and controversy. And here's a list of certain topics that we could go into in greater depth, but we're not going to. There are fault lines within Christendom. It is not, as many historians would have argued 50 years ago, a monolithic religion. In other words, it was not all the same. It wasn't homogeneous throughout. Christianity was very varied. There were controversies, there were schisms, there were factions within Christianity prior to the Reformation. And the Reformation will simply highlight those fault lines and kind of exacerbate the tensions. So, for instance, within scholasticism, which was that form of late medieval thought, there was tension because there were those who opposed it. There were the humanists who had emerged by the early and mid 1400s. There were different factions within scholasticism that were at odds with each other, the so called debate between the realists and the nominalists. Not everyone loved Thomas Aquinas' attempt to reconcile the Christian faith and the physics of Aristotle. Okay, um, there was a period called the Babylonian captivity of the church, in which, through a very convoluted process, the popes had actually moved out of Rome and moved to a place in France, a city in France called Avignon. And the Avignon papacy was characterized by very sort of princely, courtly living. It was under the influence of the French monarchy. It was seen as being too secular and not faithful enough to the calling of the church, that had become corrupt. And this was a long period of time, almost 70 years, and it's actually throughout the plague years that we see the so-called Babylonian captivity of the church. Well, this leads in turn to rival popes being set up. A French pope had left Avignon to visit Rome one day, and when he was in Rome, he died. So the Italian cardinals elected their own pope, an Italian. The French cardinals heard about this, and they elected their own pope. And so you had two rival popes, one French, one Italian, who mutually excommunicated each other. And this schism goes on from approximately 1377 until it's finally resolved in 1415. And there's some aftershocks until the 1420s. So this was really, really a kind of low tide for the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church, where the popes themselves are called into question. And there's even a movement there that says that maybe, just maybe, the popes shouldn't be running the church. Maybe the church should be run by a council of bishops under the presidency of the pope, a somewhat more democratic institution, and that official rulings have to be made by not by a monarch, but by kind of all the bishops getting together, as a lot of decisions were made in the imperial church under Constantine, the Roman Emperor Constantine. He called bishops together to make decisions together. And there were many in the so-called consularist movement who wanted to do that. They wanted to see the church governed by church councils, thus consular. Okay. Here we see actually the division of Christianity in the Western Church. We can see here that those countries that were sort of here in yellow, or excuse me, orange, okay, these tended to support the French Pope. Okay. Avignon was a city right here in southern France, while those in blue, okay, England included in that, England and Ireland, okay, tended to support the Italian Pope. Okay. The Holy Roman Empire was split. Most northerners tended to support the French Pope, while the southerners supported the Italian Pope. Okay. And what's interesting about this is that will actually lead to a similar fault line in the Reformation. If you look at the areas that are going, that are blue here, especially up in here, right? And if you saw that also in the Holy Roman Empire, you would see that these were the areas that would become Lutheran, the Church of England, Calvinist. They would leave the Catholic Church. Okay? Poland was very divided during the Reformation. Denmark, Sweden, England, these countries all up in here tended to be, during the time of the Reformation, not Catholic anymore. These countries down in here tended to remain Catholic. Okay? So we can actually see that sort of fault line begin to emerge. Other criticisms of Catholicity, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's the nominalists versus the realists in the Roman Catholic Church. That was the controversy within the scholastic movement. Realists tended to follow Plato. Nominalists tended to be more followers of Aristotle. Okay, and so they didn't quite get along, and that whole debate is swept aside once you have the rise of the humanists, who disagree with all forms of scholasticism. Two men in particular make charges against the Roman Catholic Church and the way it does things, the church and the way it does things in the Middle Ages. One is named John Wycliffe, the other is Jan Hus. Wycliffe was an Englishman, and he generally distrusted the clergy. He wanted a better teaching of the church, teaching in the hand of individuals, individual laymen. For instance, a Bible to read in English, and he wanted a much more common man type of religion. And we could oversimplify and say that, but Wycliffe was a professor. He believed that that learned clergy were really, really important, and that a closed clergy that didn't associate with people very well, that kept very secretive, that kept the mysteries of the faith mysteries, that wasn't productive. And his followers were preachers who went out there and they really enjoyed talking, sort of street corner type preachers. They were often called lollards because of the la 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 of their preaching. Um, Wycliffe escapes any official. He runs afoul of the church authorities, but he has very, very powerful protectors in the realm of England, most notably John of Gaunt, who was essentially king in all but name. He was actually the uncle of King Richard II, and he would be the father of King Henry IV. So he's an incredibly powerful English nobleman who likes Wycliffe and who likes the Lollards. And so they kind of get away with it. But these will be an early group that will sort of lead kind of what we call a proto-Reformation in England. So there will be a group that's already there in England that's looking for kind of reform when the Reformation comes to England in the 1530s, 40s, 50s. Jan Hus is a Bohemian, okay, the modern day Czech Republic. Very, very similar beliefs to that of Wycliffe. He is invited to a council of the church to discuss some of the things he's saying, some of his criticisms, and he is condemned and he is burned at the stake because they don't really like these criticisms. So, two guys, similar ideas, two very different ends. Okay. The followers of Hus will remain very active through the time of the Reformation, and sometimes there will be early Protestant reformers who will say, "We agree with Jan Hus," and that immediately labels them as heretics, and they could be burned at the stake too. There were other criticisms of specific aspects of the Catholic Church. Increasing wealth and access to power, cushy relationships between bishops and kings, priests and local aristocrats. It seemed like the church was becoming an arm of the government, or at least an arm of the French, Spanish, English aristocracy, and that made it look like it was not there to support the ministry to the poor and to the outsiders and that kind of New Testament type teaching and faith that many people expected of the church. There were other kinds of abuses of power. Um, some of these things ranged from favoring relatives of priests to become other priests. This is called nepotism. So it just so seemed that a lot of families had a lot of priests in them, and they tended to be favored. Um, Sometimes you would actually have popes whose quote unquote nephews would become popes as well. In fact, they were the illegitimate children of that pope. Um, Absenteeism. This means that you were supposed to be let's say, a parish priest in Pittstown, and instead you lived in Miami and you had somebody cover for you because you really didn't like to live in Pittstown, you like living in Miami. The criticism was if you're supposed to be a bishop or a priest or whatever, you should live in the parish or the diocese where you're supposed to be employed. Simony was another clerical abuse. This was actually selling an office to the highest bidder. So let's say a rich man wants a job for life for his son or something like that. And so he says, okay, I'll donate, $100,000 to the church, and that little parish that's over there that has a nice little annual income, um, from the people donating money and so forth and so on. My son's going to be the priest over there, and he might be the most godless pagan, but I've contributed the money and I've bought the parish, and now I'm okay. My son is provided for. And he has an income, and all is well with the world. That's the kind of thing that we mean by simony, selling the offices of the church to people who are willing to pay for it. Okay. The other is ignorance. When you have special relatives, when you have offices of the church being bought, um, sometimes the quality of knowledge in the priest is not as great as it ought to be. And so a lot of priests who don't even know Latin, even though they're supposed to be saying the Mass in Latin. don't know basic theology of the church, don't know the Bible, don't know canon law of the church, the official declarations that are handed down from popes and from the teaching arm of the church. We've mentioned the schism before, so we'll pass over that again. Indulgences. We talked about these during the Crusades. These were promises made by the church to intercede for people who had committed certain offenses in the name of the faith. So if a Crusader knight had died on crusade and did not have time to repent, the church would intercede on his behalf and beseech God to, get them out of purgatory and into heaven faster. Well, after the Crusades, there was an opportunity for that. So people wanted an indulgence, so they go on a fancy pilgrimage somewhere. And they could get a certificate of indulgence. But then some people say, well, I'm too old, or I don't have the time to go on a pilgrimage to get this special treatment by the church. So what if I just give enough money? And once that started to happen, that became an abuse, or seen by many to be an abuse. It sounded like people were buying their way into heaven. In particular, there was a Dominican monk named Johann Tetzel, who had a little jingle as he ran around the countryside selling indulgences. And we could see this picture here of him sitting on his donkey. And here's the money box here, and folks running up to it. Okay, and here's Tetzel, and it says this line down here in German. The end of it, the very famous part, is, "When the coin in the coffer rings, the soul to heaven springs." So when the money clanks in the money box, the soul pops out of purgatory and into heaven. Okay, so if you contribute enough money, you can just buy your way into heaven. This rubbed a lot of people in Europe the wrong way. And one of the reasons why it rubbed people the wrong way, we will talk about in the next lecture, and that is the distinction between righteousness and justification. Right? And we'll have a little look at this right now, but that is really where we're going to be going from here. What is this distinction? What does it mean for Christians to go to heaven? To what is the Christian way of believing the path to heaven exists? So we'll look at that a little bit more in our next lecture series. And so for the time being, I'd like to thank you very much.